Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Course Snack Break. My name is Brittany McLean, and today we're going to be talking about the new Pure and Freeform product. Geoff, so nice to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Absolutely. And for those of you keeping track, I always try to say the date. So if you're listening to this later, you know when this information was said. But today is April 13th, 2022. And we're very excited to have you here. I think I see a lot of familiar faces. It's nice to see you all in the chat. You have been put on mute automatically, but as you can see, people are already chatting in. That's a great way to let us know if you have questions as we go through the presentation today. If you like what you see, any comments, we love to see those coming through. I'll be keeping an eye on that as Geoff goes through the presentation today, and we'll try to ask your questions in real time, or if we need to save them to the end of the presentation, we'll make sure that we get to all your questions as we go throughout the presentation today. Also, if you have to step away or you want to reference this, any of these slides or share this presentation later, you can look for an email shortly after we wrap that'll include all of that information, as well as an additional email for your gift card as a thank you for coming today. So again, please do use the chat if you've got questions as we go throughout it, but I want to make sure I give plenty of time to our guest, Geoff, today. So Geoff, thanks for being here. If you could start us off and just talk a little bit about the company, and then you can dive right into the presentation. That would be awesome.
Totally. So yeah, my name is Geoff. I'm nice to meet everyone. Thank you for joining. So I'm the creative director of PureFreeForm. I oversee all the early kind of design development as well as the technology work, and I've been designing metal for over 20 years for the construction industry. Kind of selling to different companies first before PureFreeForm was created, which really aims to create a contextual solution for interior and exterior projects. It's a pretty young company, so before I get into the new collection, I thought I would just give a kind of overview. So the idea behind the creation of the company was that there's metals are a common material within construction. But typically they're predetermined finishes from manufacturers that aren't very inspiring. So on one end you have, kind of predetermined paint finishes. On the other hand, you have beautiful natural materials, which you can't control, which are, amazing, but are often very expensive, heavy. Owners don't want to use them. There's lots of limitations there. So the idea with PureFreeForm is it fills this middle ground where you can take things like, physical texturing, intense colors, as well as different gloss matte effects, and also contextualize them for each project so that you're not selecting from things that are not made for that particular project. So it started out as a facade company. We can, for what I call solutions-based work, which is like, wood grain, stone, Corten black, and steel. This is the Chase Arena in South San Francisco. One thing to note about the material, which I think is very important, is that you can control the gloss level. So really, when you're looking at materials, physical textures allow us to understand materiality. So the transformative power of light on the surface allows us to understand if something has specularity, like, a terracotta that's glazed, or a more substantial feel like a, Corten steel. And it's not really the design and the color as much as the texture. So here we can see that wood kind of juxtaposing with the more satin white finish. This is then moved into these interior-exterior transitional spaces because you've got a warranty, but also you're able to increase really saturated colors. So that's another limitation, especially on the exterior, is a lot of times you can't get intense colors or things that have a lot of hue to them, whereas now that's all possible. And then this is actually a project in Portland, just on 11th and Washington, that's going up right now. But there's also an ability to create natural metals that have a coating. And this is through basically putting a clear coat directly on the substrate and then putting the pigment and pearlescent ink on top of that. So I'm not going to get too much into the technology of this because it does take a long time to explain. But I think the simple way of saying is that, and this is Bellevue, Washington, this is Facebook new headquarters, where you also have these really nice corrugated pieces that then transition to the interior. But I think the important thing to understand is that basically everything is customizable. And if it's above 1,000 square feet, there's no upcharge for customization. Because there's been so many innovations with the technologies, there's been this really big push to kind of create things that are more design driven and interesting rather than just meeting the status quo. So last year, I guess it was during COVID, we released a finish called specular. And so this was the first technology we had that actually created physical texturing on the surface. So again, if you wanted to do a blackened steel that had more of a satin finish, or a Corten steel that was very matte, or some of these hybrid terracottas, that have a higher, gloss level and have this more of a fragmented surface, all those things were possible. And so after wrapping up that collection, we started to investigate how we can, make really interesting connections, kind of establishing the future of what metal can be, and also hopefully inspiring some creativity. So the overall collection is called MetaMetal. There's two different divisions of it, but the idea here is that it's more experiential, and these are really to inspire creativity, but also instead of directly interpreting architectural materials to create nuanced and interesting things in their own right. So the first collection is called Massive. Over the past, I would say 3 to 4 years, there's been a renewed interest in masonry materials, terracotta brick, GFRC fiber cement, things like that. And I think, this kind of large quality that they instill in projects, as well as the texture, was really important. But I think, when you're trying to replicate things directly, it can be effective for some projects, but not as always so interesting. So these kind of combine beauty with functionality and have some kind of sensitivity to texture in, cementitious terracotta, things along those lines. So these are some of the inspiration images that we used for the collection. The first finish is called Bungalow. So this is like the first kind of reduced, very dusty, muted pink color that we've put into the collection. It is kind of, focused on interiors, but there's also inspiration from David Adjay's Webster in LA, which was this really kind of interesting dyed concrete. We've seen this pop up in a couple places, but what's beautiful about this finish is that you do have this kind of cementitious texture behind it. It's very matte, so it has a physical texture to it as well. So, in corrugated profiles and different applications, I think it can be, really pretty exciting. It also works well with a lot of the other colors in the group because it has some warmth to it, but it's very subtle. Everything that you see here is interior, exterior as well. Opaline is taking the kind of a patinated green texture and then adding this kind of a granite subtexture. So when you look at this, you can actually see some of that physicality from it. And I think that's what's really exciting is that, again, if you look at most paints that are in the market, like let's say someone's going to do this in a paint finish for a facade, it could look really good on a small chip, but once it's installed and you have light hitting multiple panels, you see that everything is exactly the same gloss level. And then, subconsciously you realize that's paint. Whereas if you can see this variation between materiality and something that has a matte surface and therefore diffuses light, you get that, sensitivity to something being more substantial and appealing more to the material. So this is, great for exterior spandrel panels, in areas especially where it's like can't be as heavy. We've used this for reception desks as well as cladding monumental staircases. But I think the color is really dialed in. It's that kind of nice mid-range between green and blue, and the kind of movement between, the masonry and metal is really quite interesting. Bohemian has really fared as like the best finish received so far. I've been traveling a bunch, so I've been in offices and meeting with people. If you look at it in the image, you're getting direct light, so you're getting this really strong blue pearlescent ink pop to it, but it actually in a vertical orientation appears more like a blackened steel. So you have this subtle movement. Sometimes blackened steels do have this like blue direction to it. This is kind of, taking that to another level and then adding a pearlescent ink. Pearlescent ink is like a transparent ink that appears in certain lights. So it's not always going to be blue. It's basically like iridescence. But very, very exciting. And, I think equally interesting, it was used on a project in Chicago for a law office for some interior kind of like terraced wall paneling. Here you can see it on an exterior of a, corrugation really tight. And I think it's great because it's moving away from that kind of, blackened steel is used a lot, right? So this gives it a little bit more of a pop, contemporizes it a bit, and I think just makes it more interesting. But yeah, I think all these would be better to see in person, so I can send out them as well. So
yeah,
Dune
it's
is
a similar look as the one that you showed, and it really is. It's one of those things that catches you because you see black and in so many places, and you kind of do a double take. It's unexpected and like a little bit playful, I would say. So it's
totally, and there's a familiarity to other materials. Like I think, what I've realized, we did a collection with a Dutch designer, Marcel Wanders, in 2016, and we kind of like gave him free creative direction on it. And he's a really interesting guy, and he's makes great art and really interesting spaces. But it was kind of like so intense and so embellished that it just fulfilled very specific projects. Whereas the idea here is that we're trying to take a familiarity of current materiality, so we're not like doing super crazy colors or things that can only be used one time and then you forget about it. But at the same time, making them not appear directly like the material or just like a metal, so kind of this new direction that we're excited. So hybrid concept, right? And so Indiana limestone, that's been requested a lot. Again, I think, there's truth in materials, and sometimes there's concerns with people, directly replicating something. This one's amazing because, again, you can see the texture on the surface, but it really goes well with almost any finish because of how subtle the tone is. So you can get this really nice, white cementitious texture. You can also get it as a complement to something like Bohemian, where you have a nice, color play as well. But really, really beautiful finish, and rounds out the massive collection. And here we can see, for both Bohemian and Dune, concepts together, but also just how you can get that really nice texture coming from it. So the second part of the collection is called Morph. This is what I'm calling kind of like a frit metal. So, with a frit glass, you have like a, reflective surface, and then you have this ceramic overlay that creates the texture. This is a very similar concept, and so it's an extreme gloss matte effect. So you can actually see, a design on the surface. And so this is, again, great for, I think, exterior, spandrel panels, but equally interesting for ceilings. We do a lot of work with, Armstrong, Arctura, supplying them with some materials. And I have tons of respect for the large ceiling companies with the engineering and the technology they've created over the past decade. But at the same time, I think sometimes panels get very complicated because the surfaces themselves are not very interesting. So if you can reinterpret those surfaces in really cool ways that create, patterns and effects, I think there's a possibility of almost creating a value engineering initially while still creating really great spaces. So Southside is a combination of, different gray tones. There's that gloss matte effect, so you can see that reflective base, and then there's this more kind of, light heather gray textured overlay. It is really interesting because it can really move in its directionality. Here is another colorway of it we can see on a ceiling, where you're doing this really cool juxtaposition between like, cool and warm and textured and reflective. But then put on a ceiling, you're really getting this intense gloss matte effect, but also in this really cool running bond pattern. And what's great about it is that, it doesn't matter if this is a wood grain or a specialty finish, there's no upcharge in any of the finishes at all. So there's this ability to really create, interesting ceilings and walls from this. This is some concept imagery, although this is on the left-hand side, it's our material. The upper left-hand side is a red list-free building in Sacramento called CalStars, and it has this really cool pinstripe effect. So I'm showing, if you want to create a sense of verticality, you can now use different textures to really do that in a really subtle or semiotic way. Spring is kind of the most intense and I would say, like interesting color. It does have a familiarity to like a Corten steel or some of these more rich terracottas, but it is just this really deep, beautiful color, and then it has this gold overlay. And so it reminds me of like a antiqued or, mercury glass, but then with these really intense pops of color, and it does have this really, nice reflectivity to it. I think it's, more kind of hospitality driven generally because of these really, warm colors, really regal and very beautiful. But then with this gold pearl inflection to it, you can kind of see in this, but it pops a bit more than that in the actual thing. You get that nice kind of contrast and subtle effect. And then float is really pretty interesting. So there's a project that Herzog and Miron did in Barcelona called the Forum, and it's a super expensive inference coated stainless that's embossed, debossed, and perforated. It was, driven by a bank, so they had tons of money for it. But most projects are not driven like that. So Herzog and Miron said, "Can you create something like this?" At the same time, we were talking to Foster's and partners for creating a titanium finish. So we kind of built the two into each other because there were some similarities. So the upper left is titanium. Actually, both these are titanium, where you have that almost like large scale galvanized effect. And then on the right-hand side is that Herzog and Miron project where you can see, you're getting this really experience of materiality, right? Where you have reflective areas, you have diffusive areas, but it's very dynamic. And depending on how you move along, you just get this completely different experience with the materiality. And I think that's the point with all of these is that they're not static, right? It's not just like, here's a Corten, here's a blackened steel. They actually have, definition and depth to them. And so although these are all like stocked and ready to, be used in the market, there is also this ability for us to design any of them or modify them in terms of color, texture, and anything else. And then the final one from Morph is Patria, which is this kind of polka dot, very kind of classic in terms of a frit glass, but I think very interesting too, to avoid perforations. I'm not a big fan of perforations on exteriors or in transit areas because of the maintenance and just how dirty things get. So this is a way to create this really interesting effect and texture without actually, perforating the material, which makes it much more solid. You can still micro perforate it for acoustics, for ceilings or anything like that, but there is lots of flexibility there. So I know that's about 20 minutes, so I will end it there. I'll see if there's any questions, but again, I appreciate everyone joining for the launch of this collection.
That's awesome. These are so cool. I love the images you showed. I love in the one, I think it was the one right before the dots, how even in the back, it almost looked like water, like on the ceiling. The way
exactly. Yeah.
With that.
And I think that's we're having sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we were having conversations actually with a firm in Portland, GBD, about there's a new Kengokuma waterfront project at River Place, where the hotel is on the water. But basically, they're trying to incorporate this sense of, water into the facade, but not in such a literal way. And so that's, it's interesting you brought that up because I think there are, the more you look at the materials, there are these ways to really, experience them in different ways, but also get these more semiotic under, tones of, design or location.
I love that. Yeah, and I can see that just depending on what materials you're pairing it with or having it next, they can all kind of have a very different look, feel, like presence. And I think that's really, really neat. And again, something that we're not necessarily seeing in the metal, or, again, people just sort of, you forget all the different options that you have with that. Like it sort of, it's always good. These presentations always leave me excited to be like, oh yeah, that's right. And there's all these other options. It's great. So I don't see any questions yet, but I'll give it a second while we're sort of wrapping up. Just remind everyone that if you are interested in samples, you'll be redirected after this to the source website where you can reach out if you need any of the contact information for your local reps. We can help connect that. Let's see. We did get a question here. Sarah asks if you can play around with the transparency of some of these options.
Sure. So that's a great question, and I wish metal was more transparent. So, unfortunately for the actual substrate, there's not too much we can do, and I think it kind of leaves glass and different kind of like plastics essentially as the best options for that. With the actual inks themselves, you definitely can play around with the transparency, for sure. So one of the big things that defines this process is, and I mentioned it before, but I'll get into it a little bit more. So it's something called pearlescent ink. So if you think of, when you're like looking, there's oil like in a puddle or like fish scales or something, right? Like depending on how light hits it, the color can change intensely or disappear. And that's because there's a certain transparency to that color. And so we can basically take a natural pearlescent ink and form it into, either like an overlay or different patterns. so that depending on how you see it, you can have a pattern appear or disappear. And actually, if you go to our website and check out the collection with Marcel Wanders, it was meant to kind of capture the changing nature of urban environments. And so like in certain light, you'll see patterns appear and other they totally disappear, right? So you have this totally, different interaction with the materiality on this more intimate scale. But yeah, so maybe a bit too long of an answer, but short answer is they can't be transparent on the sheets themselves because it's metal. If you want to play around with the different overlays and kind of textures of transparency, that's definitely possible, if that makes sense.
That's perfect. That's great. No, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't see any other questions coming in, but this was super helpful. And like I say, the recording and a copy of the slides will be sent to you automatically afterwards. But if you do have any more questions, you'll be redirected after this, and we'll get you the contact information for the team at Pure and FreeForm. But Geoff, thank you so much for showing us these new products. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining in. Last thing I would say is that, definitely reach out to source for any of the samples, because obviously showing them on the screen is very different than seeing them physically, and I think they're much more inspiring physically. So but thanks everyone, and if you need anything from our side, feel free to reach out.
Awesome, perfect. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all back here the same time next week for the next Source Snack Break. Thanks, Geoff. Have a good rest of your day.
Cool, thank you.
Everyone. Bye.
Bye.